From Ukraine, global powers are shifting their attention to the South Pacific, a region that appears as small dots on a world map, but is actually a large strategic area. And the players in the tussle are the old China versus the US and its allies. Leading the Pacific battle against China this time is America's Quad partner Australia. Both Australia and China have launched visits in the Pacific. Xi Jinping's top diplomat, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, is on a 10-day tour to 8 Pacific Island countries. The latest, Samoa and China have also signed a bilateral agreement. The details of this deal remains unclear, though the two countries have promised greater collaboration. Earlier, China also signed security pacts with the Solomon Islands. Despite objections from Australia, US, Japan and even New Zealand, a country that has mostly maintained distance from the ongoing strategic wars, these countries fear it could give China a military presence in the region. Australia has also worked in recent years to revitalize its leadership position in the Pacific. The Australian government is its biggest donor with the largest diplomatic footprint in the region. Newly elected Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has put matters related to the Pacific on top of his agenda. He says his party will increase security and aid support in the Pacific region. Australian government plans to increase foreign aid by $525 million and an increase of funding for the Pacific Maritime Security Program.
We are friends with our Pacific Island neighbours. We know that they're sovereign nations and have a right to determine their own future. We want to be partners with them, though. All of our engagement in the Pacific will be no strings attached. It'll be one that respect the sovereignty of those nations, but one that also understands the role that we have historically played since the Second World War. It's unfortunate that in recent times there's been not a step up so much as a stuff up in terms of the relations with our Pacific Island neighbours. My government intends to engage in a cooperative and respectful way.
Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong, in a trip to Fiji, had warned Pacific countries against the consequences of signing and accepting security deals with Beijing. The West, especially the United States, has been irked by China's growing economic and geopolitical clout in the Pacific. Over the last 2 decades, Beijing has steadily built influence in the South Pacific. Since World War II, the Pacific has largely enjoyed a benign status on the geopolitical stage. But it all changed with China's growing presence in the region. Since 2006, China's trade, aid and diplomatic and commercial activities in the region has been steadily scaling up. Two-way trade with China has overtaken that of Australia since 2013. For the Solomon Islands, two-way trade with China now makes up 46% of all trade. The map on your screen shows the shared ocean region between China and Australia and the 10 islands Beijing is planning to approach. So what is China exactly offering to these countries? Let's understand. In its deal, Beijing is offering significant financial assistance, a free trade agreement, and access to Beijing's lucrative market of 1.4 billion people. China is also mulling training the local police in these countries, but like all other deals, Chinese agreements have a catch too. And here's what Beijing wants in return: access to local cybersecurity, expansion of its political influence in the region, greater access to natural resources through marine mapping. Let us also understand the risk of China's rise. The first risk, which could also have a profound impact, is that China could be trying to use its leverage through diplomacy, debt, trade, or establishing military bases in the region. A Chinese military base as little as 2,000 kilometers from Australia's coast would force a wedge between Australia and its strategic anchor, the United States. The second risk, which has a higher probability of occurring, is that China and Chinese businesses, through elite capture and corruption, are rapidly undermining institutions of governance in countries in the region and misusing public resources for the benefit of a few individuals. But recently, Beijing has also been struggling to maintain its momentum in the South Pacific. Traditional partners in the region are scrutinizing Chinese debt. They are wary of China's debt-trap diplomacy, something that countries in South Asia like Sri Lanka and Pakistan have already fallen victim to. And caught between the battle of the world superpowers are 13 million people living in 14 sovereign nations and 7 territories, spanning over 15% of the world's surface, an area that plays an extremely crucial role in global climate system, global economy, and now in global politics. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is John Erath, Policy Director of the Center for Arms Control. John Erath, welcome to WION.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
What's your view on China wooing 10 small Pacific nations? Some say it is a bid by Beijing to wrest control of the region. Others say it is a dangerous move.
I think this is very consistent with China's foreign policy in all parts of the world. They seek to build influence. They seek to increase the markets for their exports. China's economic growth has been built on exports, and so they continually need to develop and maintain their markets. And I think they have seen the Pacific area as a very lucrative area for this.
John, China's growing footprint in the region also brings a strategic challenge to the United States' doorstep at a time when the U.S. and China relationship is under considerable strain. Going back to the recent Quad summit, do you think the group will be able to curtail China's expansion plans in the near future?
I think it's very concerning that China is expanding its military spending to the degree that it is. It's doubling and tripling not just its conventional military, but also its nuclear forces. This obviously is a cause for concern among China's neighbors and the world as a whole. I think it is very prudent of the Quad countries to be discussing this challenge, but it's also important to understand that the essential area in which there's competition with China is not necessarily military, but economic and digital. In the future, the digital world will go either one of two ways. Either the vision of the democratic countries, that digital networks would be used for the free flow of information, or that of China and authoritarian countries, that digital networks would become an instrument of state control. And how we address this is going to have profound implications for how the world of the 21st century plays out.
Why is it significant for China to take control of South Pacific?
It's an area in which there are tremendous natural resources, the kinds of resources that Chinese industry will depend on increasingly in the future. It's an area through which a great deal of the world's shipping lanes pass. And as I noted, China's economy is export dependent. And so there is tremendous strategic value, not just in the Pacific, but in the ocean lanes leading to that area, in the Indian Ocean as well.
John, finally, critics would argue China's interest in the Pacific Islands puts the countries in the region in a terrible position. But where do they run to when it has been made obvious that the U.S. has neglected them? How and where do they strike a balance?
I think they have to be very careful to watch out for their own interests. As you mentioned earlier, China practices the debt trap diplomacy that has already affected several countries very negatively. And the countries in the Pacific region will be paying attention to this and will be trying to make better decisions as to how they will order their affairs. They will continue to partner with each other, with other regional states such as Australia or New Zealand or Indonesia, and with the United States as well.
I've been talking to John Erath, who's a policy director of the Center for Arms Control, live from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for making time and for talking to WION today.
You're very welcome.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.